checking my computer here to make sure that this stream is coming through strong. So give me one moment while I do that. There we go. Looks like we're good. Excellent. So again, welcome to Dr. B Music Theory. Today, we're going to start off by talking about how do the different modes feel differently. And if you have some questions, the chat is enabled. I'm going to go to the chat after we have this conversation. But this is a question that came from one of my subscribers. It actually was inspired by one of my subscribers. The question was more about how to understand the modes a little bit better and how to identify them when you see them in a score, whether that be Ralph Vaughan Williams' Fantasia on Themes by Thomas Tallis, or a Liszt Rhapsody that uses some unusual modes, or perhaps even a Rachmaninoff Prelude. All these classical pieces, as well as a lot of contemporary and popular music, use modes. So the question was originally, how do you spot them and identify them? But for me, I started thinking about it, and the bigger question that's equally as important is, how do they feel differently? Because each mode has a different feeling. So before we talk about the modes, we got to back up a little bit and we talk about scales. So scales are a collection of pitches in order. Instead of jumping around from, let's say, C, G, D, A, it's kind of like up and in the kind of by ascending pitch, all the collection of pitches that belong together into that scale. Okay, let me say that again. It's the organization of a collection of pitches in ascending order that creates your scale. Now, typically scales range from 5 notes to 12 notes. And I'm talking about Western music here, so I'm not talking about music that has more than 12 notes in the octave. But for what we're talking about, or what I'm talking about, shall I say, 5 is usually the smallest, right? Below that, you're talking about if you have 1 note is not a scale. 2 notes, although you could say, well, it's a collection, it's really called an interval. 3 notes, 3 notes is like, it could be a triad, it could be something else. 4 notes are called tetrachords if they're in that order, which is something in ancient Greece. So we're talking like 2,000 years, more than 2,000 years, like 2,500 years ago, they used these things called tetrachords, which were really kind of like a 4-note scale. But what they would do is they would link they would find a note in common and link 2 tetrachords, therefore making like a 7-note scale, which is more familiar to us now in contemporary times. So really 4 is a little bit unusual in modern music theory. So really start with 5-note scales as being kind of like the smallest number. And if you all want to test yourselves, you can go ahead and say, well, what's the most common 5-note scale called? You can put that in the chat if you want, if you're watching this live. But I'm going to tell you really soon, there's a very common 6-note scale. You can try to guess what that is. 7-note scale, this is the most common, right? 7-note, when people talk about scales, it's so common that we're talking about 7-note scales, it's almost assumed. So what kinds of, there's more than one, right? And for 5 and 6, there's really just one that's really common. For 7, there's more than one. 8-note scales are what do we call that? 9, 10, and 11 are pretty uncommon in terms of numbers of notes in the scale. So this is pretty uncommon, so we don't really have a lot of these. But a 12-note scale is also common. So go ahead, let's see if you came up with what I came up with. Pentatonic is our 5-note. Whole tone scale is our most common 6-note scale. 7-note scales are your major scale, your melodic minor scale, your harmonic minor scale. These are all 7-note scales. 8-note scales, these are your diminished scales or octatonic scales. And 12 note is your chromatic. So those are your most common scales. And within 7 note, you even get into other things like double harmonic minor and something often what are referred to as the gypsy scales go into these 7 note scale patterns. So 7 has by far the most numerous number of different kinds of scales. But pentatonic, whole tone, all the different kinds of 7 note scales, diminished as 8 note scales, chromatic. All of these scales are essentially collection of pitches with a specific relationship. So if we talk about a major scale, let's just break that out. We start with our root note. Let's call it 1. And circle it, 1. It then has a major second, a major third, a perfect fourth, a perfect fifth, a major sixth, and a major 7. That's the collection of pitches. Now, if above that, now in order for us to go from scales to modes, we also have to understand what the interval is between each step. So very often when you start learning music theory, they talk about a major scale being whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half in terms of whole step, whole step. So whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, and then half step at the end to get back to your starting note. So that idea of a collection of whole steps and half steps is fundamental to scales, especially 7 note scales. And let's break down what that then means as well. So a whole step is a major second interval. And a half step, and actually let me rewrite it a little bit differently. So a half step, like what we have between the 3rd and 4th scale degree, is a minor second. A whole step is a major second. Now when we get to harmonic minor and some of the double harmonic minor scales, we have an augmented second. So some theory texts will call it a whole plus half, right? So let's do like this. And let me write that a little bit neater so you can all see that if you're watching the video. But essentially, when we're talking about 7 note scales, we're talking about different relationships of seconds. Now you might say, Dr. B, what about the diminished second? Well, the diminished second is enharmonically the same note as what you start with. So if we say, that's a minor second, that's a diminished second. So, if you say, I got a scale made up of all diminished seconds, you're just playing one note now, aren't you? All right, so we don't really talk about the diminished second because of that. But a minor second is definitely 2 distinct frequencies, 2 distinct pitches, major second, augmented second. And we know in terms of music theory, we don't go beyond augmented. We don't have like double augmented, at least in traditional music theory. So when we're talking about scales, we're talking about these collections of seconds, especially when we're talking about our 7 note scales. In the case of our whole tone scale, it's all major seconds. So a whole tone scale, I don't want to get ahead of myself. So that's what we're talking about. So keep in mind, when we have our scale, it's a collection of these whole steps, half steps, perhaps augmented seconds. And it doesn't matter, where we start. It's still like that same collection, that same order. Like, so if you're going up and down, there's always going to be whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, right? There's that pattern within the linear. Even if we started here on the half, whole, 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 half, it still has that kind of collection. So it's important to remember that a scale, in and of itself, just that collection, has a certain feeling, right? So a major scale feels differently than a melodic minor scale, feels different than a harmonic minor scale feels different than a double harmonic minor scale. Doesn't matter what note you start on, and you'll notice I'm saying doesn't matter what note you start on a couple times, because that's the key to when we start talking about modes. So scales have a feeling as a collection, and it doesn't matter what note you start on. And a mode is changing the note you start on, and that also changes the feeling. It modifies the feeling. So let me give you an example. And I pulled out my saxophone for today just so that I could easily demonstrate some of these scales and how they feel differently. So let's just listen to a major scale, okay? And this is eventually going to be any mode. Oops, I played a chromatic passing tone. I apologize right at the end. So ignore that part. That was not part of the feeling of the major scale. So that collection, even if I start anywhere, right? So that has a certain feeling to it, that collection of pitches with those relationships within themselves. Not even talking about what note it starts on, just the collection within itself. And that feeling, I argue, is very different than say, this feeling. And to be fair, I probably shouldn't play that bass note because that immediately establishes a mode. So let me try again. Let me go back to the major scale, or say the major scale and any of its modes. Now let me change that to what would be the ascending melodic minor in all of its modes. So that's a different sound. Now let's go to harmonic minor in all of its modes. I'm just starting on different notes, so it's not always what you would expect necessarily. And now how about double harmonic? So I would ask you, spend some time and see if you could put words to how those different scales feel. And admittedly, it can encompass more than just one emotion. It can encompass a pretty broad range. But I think, and I hope you agree with me, that they do feel different. When I played those 4 different scales, they felt different. And so let's do that. I'm just going to play like 5 seconds of each one and see if you can write down or just make a mental note to yourself, what does that scale feel like? And I'm not going to tell you which one. I'm going to mix up the orders here, but because I want you to pay attention to the feeling, okay? So that's 1. 2. 3. 4, right? So what I did in terms of the order is I started off with the melodic minor, I then went to double harmonic, then harmonic minor, and then finished up with the major scale. But this is something you can also do, and it's probably going to take some time. It's probably not going to just happen right here as you're listening to this video. It's going to happen as you play it on the piano and start trying to really think, well, what does that feel like? And this is what we need to do as musicians. We need to be really in touch with our feelings. Repressed musicians usually don't tend to be good musicians. So thinking about all of that is probably the most fundamental part to begin with. Now, after that, changing what notes we start on in our collection. Okay, so we have our scale, which is the collection of pitches. In this case, we're going to focus in on 7 notes. But within that collection, what note we start on then modifies that feeling. So let me show you how that works. And let's start with our harmonic minor scale, just because that's something that I haven't talked a lot about here on Dr. B Music Theory, and there's just so many different aspects to talk about. So a harmonic minor scale, if we say on C, we go C, D, E flat, F, G, A flat, B. Okay? So this would be our harmonic minor scale, and if we use our whole step, half step, augmented second rule, and actually let's use our seconds, because that gives it a certain unity. It's either going to be a minor second, major second, or augmented second. So the first interval, C to D, is a major second, D to E flat is a minor second, E flat to F, major second, F to G, major second, G to A flat, minor second, A flat to B, augmented second, and I will put the C at the top to wrap it up, which is another minor second. So this collection of pitches can be rearranged in any order. It's still that scale. It's just what you would call a mode. So let me dial back for 1 second. What makes a mode a mode? It has to do with what's the tonal center, the tonal focus, the singular pitch that all the other notes in the scale revolve around. That's what makes a mode a mode. So if instead of the C, I emphasize the E flat. Now how do I emphasize it? Well, I might play the note at the beginning and the end of every phrase, or I might just have a larger percentage of that note, or I just might have that longer note value for that note. That's just how you emphasize a note. So you're using rhythm, note duration, and melodic shape to show where is your tonal center, where is your emphasis, where's your home base. So if I make C the home base, this is a harmonic minor scale. But the same collection of pitches focused in on E flat becomes a mode of the harmonic minor scale. So in the original question that was asked to me, how do I pick out modes in a score? What you do is you look for a tonal center, a tonal focus. If in a piece of music you see everything kind of moving, coming back to E flat, everything kind of revolves around the E flat, what you might eventually realize I'm playing the E flat down low, I come back to it a lot, I have things that go away for it in a melodic shape and then come back to it. So I'm emphasizing the E flat. This doesn't change that we're using the same collection of pitches, that same scale, but we are emphasizing a different note in that scale, therefore that creates a different mode. When you're looking at music and you're analyzing it and you start going, wow, this is weird, you know, Dr. B said that normally 5 is a, you know, you raise the leading tone in a minor so that 5 can go back to 1, but that's not what's happening here. And you start seeing unusual chord sonorities. That's a great indicator that you might be observing something that is actually modal. It's using a collection of pitches from a scale you might be familiar with, but they're emphasizing a different note than you're familiar that everything revolves around. So that changes the sonorities. It might change the kind of harmonic progressions that are more expected in tonal music of, let's say, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, people like that. So that's how you kind of keep your eyes open in a score, is when you see unusual sonorities, normal major, minor, augmented, diminished triads you'd normally expect on different scale degrees. And when you see chord changes that start to not fit the traditional harmonic chart of progression, and that's something I've talked about in some of my other videos, then you can look and you can ask yourself, well, is it modal? That's not the only reason, the only option. It could be that you've modulated or that they're using some other type of chromatic harmony. But modal, a modal shift is another possibility for you to look at. So when we take this collection of pitches, and let's say we do what I just suggested, and we start. Actually, let's not make it the E flat. Let's do something different. Let's do it on the. Let's make the G, right? So we're going to use the same pitches, G, A flat, and actually I'm gonna write it down a little bit slower because I'm going to do something. G, A flat, B, C, D, E flat, F, G, right? So now it's the same collection of pitches, but we're emphasizing as our tonal center or our modal center a different pitch. Before I start mapping out how that's different in terms of the sequence of the seconds, let's map out the actual interval from that emphasized modal center. So the D is a major second, the E flat is a minor third, the F is a perfect fourth, the G is a perfect fifth, the A flat is a minor sixth, and the B is a major seven, and of course the C is the octave, right? So major second, minor third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, minor sixth, major seven. That's where a lot of the emotion comes from. That relationship from the modal center with everything that goes above it. So again, here's the critical thing I want you to remember. There's a feeling for this order of seconds, this collection, this sequence of seconds. That scale creates one emotion. But what really modifies and really more than modifies, really turbocharges that feeling and that emotion is how those intervals relate above the modal center, right? So a minor third, if we take the kind of cliche, minor means either sad or dramatic. Well, we got that in there. That's that minor third, which is going to feel different than if it was a major third. But we take that same sequence of seconds, right? It's the exact same sequence, right? We're just starting it in a different part. We go, so G to A flat is our minor second, as we had augmented second, as we had to C is a minor second, right? And we know C to D is a major second, so we're just copying it down. It's the same order of seconds and the kinds of seconds we have. And we're just starting on a different note, right? So it's the same pattern and sequence, just starting on a different point. But let's notice now how these intervals change if we shift to the G as our modal center. Now, instead of a major second, we have a minor second. And instead of a minor third, we've got a major third. We still have the perfect fourth, we still have the perfect fifth, we still have the minor sixth. But we now have a minor seven instead of a major seven. And then we have the octave. So what's changed between our harmonic minor scale, which is our kind of our parent scale, and our mode, our fifth mode? So the C is mode 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Mode 5, starting on the G of our C harmonic minor scale. What's different? Well, our seconds are different. Oops, I miswrote something here. That should be a 3 right there because it's a major third. Our third is different. Fourth, fifth, sixth are the same, and our seventh. So 3 intervals are different. And let's listen and hear how that change feels differently. So again, harmonic minor scale, that collection, that specific order of the different types of seconds, because not every scale has this order of seconds. So that has a feeling, and then when we change what note is the modal center, that changes the feeling from there. So let's that's our harmonic minor scale with the C in the bass. Well, I'm transposing it. I'm talking I'm playing a tenor saxophone, so that's a different key. So for those of you at home with perfect pitch or listening and saying, wait a minute, he's playing a B flat. You're correct. I'm playing it so that I'm thinking in terms of C as a saxophonist. But the principles are the same. So let's hear that shift. Same collection of pitches, different modal center. Right? And I'm playing it so that you can kind of think about what's that feeling and how's that feeling differently. This feeling, this fifth mode, is different than this. It's a different feeling. Now there's similarities, of course, because it's coming from the same scale, right? That's my kind of point here. But it is also a difference, right? That major third feels different than the minor third. The minor second feels different than the major second. And so that's a critical thing to spend some time with and try to figure out how those modes feel different. Now, here's some of the challenges as you're doing this. If you go online and just look up some of the different scales, there are some wildly different naming conventions for the different scales. So I've encountered people say, Dr. B, do you know about the blah, 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 blah scale? And I'll be like, no, I've never heard of it. And then they tell me what it is. I'd be like, oh, I know what that scale is. I just have a different name for it. So try not to get overwhelmed by the hundreds of different names for scales out there, right? There's not as many as you might think at first if you just do a quick online search. It could be very overwhelming. And part of becoming a better musician and a better student of music theory is to not set yourself up for being overwhelmed. To that end, let me just tell you how crazy it can be, because not only are there different naming conventions for the same scale, some of them they're contradictory. There'll be someone that says, well, this is the Spanish gypsy scale. And another says, and here are the notes. And another person, here's the Spanish gypsy scale. And it's a different collection. It's not a different mode. It's just different. They both can't be right. You mean not have those words have any meaning. So you have to kind of say, well, who's right here? So once you separate that, and as this is a warning, be careful. There's like so many different names out there. Some of these are like multiple names for the same scale, but sometimes people have different scales and they call it the same name, and that's just absolutely unacceptable. We need to put an end to that in the world. Just like, no, this is what that scale is. And you gotta realize these two aspects that I've been talking about. One is the collection and the order of these seconds, and then the other is what mode it is, right? Because those are the two factors to keep in mind. So let's just talk about some of the complexities when you get to this, right? So we look at the scale, and here are some of the names you will hear. Some people call it the fifth mode of the harmonic minor scale, right? So fifth mode of the harmonic minor scale, right? Other people call this, when you start on this note, the Spanish gypsy scale. This is it. They don't call it, and it has to start on this, so it has to have this intervallic makeup, Spanish gypsy scale. Another name for it is Spanish major scale. So obviously there's the reference that this is a scale that was used in Spain. So you have that aspect. Then you have called Spanish, some people call it Spanish Phrygian. I'm going to start writing out all these names here because I want you to actually have all this just so you can see one scale having how many different names, right? So name one, fifth mode of the harmonic minor scale. It's more not even a name of a scale, but more of a descriptive aspect of where it's coming from, right? Another one is Spanish gypsy scale, okay? And then another Spanish major scale. Now, the term gypsy here is usually applied or often applied to scales that have an augmented second. That augmented second is like the key factor that kind of starts getting people to use that word and reference that. So Romania, to a certain extent, in Spain you have this kind of idea as well. But that augmented second is a critical part. Now, when they call it Spanish major, you can see why they would do that, because it has a major third in it, right? So it's indicating that it has like a major scale aspect because it has that major third. But another name for the same scale, Phrygian dominant. And for those of you who have watched my video on modes of the major scale, we know that Phrygian is the third mode of the major scale, and it has a minor second, a perfect fourth, a perfect fifth, a minor sixth, a minor seventh, but it has a minor third. So saying Phrygian gives you all the notes, but then dominant saying that 1, major third, 5, minor 7. So G, B, D, F, that is a dominant chord or a major minor 7. So the idea of Phrygian dominant is another name that people will use for that scale. They'll call it, some people will call it the Jewish scale, because there's certain Hebrew Jewish music that uses this scale as well. They will sometimes call it the, and I'm just getting so I can spell this right, Phrygish. And this is all kind of like coming from a Jewish tradition. And then finally, Hava Raboa, and I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, and I apologize, but I'm just I did a little research here, and I wanted to share with you as much as I could. All right, so there's this whole kind of like, this scale was used in a lot of Jewish music. This was used in a lot of Spanish music. But let's see, that's 7 different names for the same scale. Right? And that's just one mode of the harmonic minor scale. There's 7 different modes. And if all of them had 7 different names, we've got 49 different names just for the different modes of the harmonic minor scale. You see how it could easily become overwhelming and be like, oh, this is too much. Just don't worry about that part. Focus in on what I was talking about here. The idea of you have a scale that's a certain sequence of seconds, and then when you modify it or change the mode, you then get different intervals above that starting note. And those are the 2 most critical aspects when we're talking about those. So I want to look here at my chat a little bit here. And I'm looking here at the bottom. Someone's saying, Dr. B, please speak slowly. My English is not good. I absolutely should do that. I sometimes speak too fast in general. So I'm happy to slow down a little bit. My apologies. Thank you for asking. So let's touch on some of these questions, and then I want to do one more thing before we wrap up on this. Wayne, thanks for coming back. Yeah, when you say my break off from doing this was really grading so many music theory final exams, music history final exams, ear training final exams, and putting together an orchestra video of people who are recording their parts individually. So it's a break from Dr. B Music Theory, but it certainly wasn't a break. So I'm going to be enjoying the next couple of weeks to try to get some relaxation in and recharge my batteries, because I intend to be doing another video for Dr. B Music Theory 2 weeks from today. But thank you, Wayne. It's good to be back. Evening, Andrew. Hello to everyone. One person here is asking a side question, unrelated, but that's fine. Why don't I do music history tutorial during these live streams? So this is something I've been thinking about doing. It's for me right now, it's a matter of time. What I want to do is, if I present something, I want to make sure I'm doing it right. So when I did the original, I guess, 49 videos of music theory, I spent a lot of time preparing for each one of those to make sure I set it, everything in the right sequence, in the right order, to really have it be top-notch quality. I mean, I know my music history, I teach it, but it's different to kind of commit it to a video that's going to go out to anyone who wants to watch it in the world. So I've been trying to find the time where I can put in the preparation. Really, it's really fine-tuning, because I do know the material, but the fine-tuning to just make sure it's really succinct, very clear, and I can present it. It's something I've been wanting to do. So right now, I kind of throw in some of those music history references when it relates directly to the music theory I'm talking about, but it's something I want to do. It's something that's going to happen at some point when the time is right, and we'll figure that out. But thank you. It's good for me to know that there's people like you who are interested in getting a little bit more from the music history perspective, because it's fascinating how everything kind of relates and connects to each other. So thank you for asking that. Yeah, I would love to do a lot of music history. It would be fun. All right. All right, so some other questions we had. So hopefully I'm speaking at a better speed for you. Good. Scale names, yeah. Yeah, again, this is my beard's getting pretty big, so thank you. I'm going for something different. Like I said, Brahms. I'm gonna see if make Brahms envious. Let's see. Does saxophone? Oh, you've never seen a saxophone for real? Oh my goodness. Well, obviously it's an instrument I love. Does it take lungs of steel? No, but it does take really good breath control and breath support. I used to swim competitively, and so I don't know if that kind of helped me out down the road. But the way the saxophone works is we got the mouthpiece. We got a little piece of wood right here. This is called the reed. So it's a piece of wood that's fairly thin. You put the air through the mouthpiece right here, and it makes the reed vibrate. So what the reed does is it closes up on the mouthpiece and then opens, right? So you get this action. And how many ever times, like the pitch, let's say A 440, that means that the reed is opening and closing 440 times per second. So if you get a soft reed with not a big tip opening like this, then my reed is a little stronger than let's say a beginner would use. It doesn't take a lot. So it's not lungs of steel. It's more like embouchure of steel. It's like all the muscles that go around your face that hold it so that the air doesn't go sliding out of the corners of your mouth. That's the steel part right there. The lungs, yes, it helps to have a big lung capacity and have good breathing. Good breathing is something a saxophonist studies. It's the control, and it's not so much steel, but control. It's that kind of. It's not like a power lifter. I always say that musicians are athletes of the little muscles. So if you're doing high jump or 500-yard dash, the big muscles of your body, you're training them to be super strong, super powerful, super strong endurance. If you're a musician, you're training like, oh, these muscles right here around my lips, these muscles here on my fingers, you're an athlete of the little muscles. So that's the way I like to put it. Alrighty. What I would like to talk about it before we move on and keep going with these questions is I would like to see if you all could play a little game with me here in the chat. And for those of you who will watch this later on, use a piece of paper, write it down. I'm going to play a little something on the saxophone using a mode. And I'm going to go back to the modes of the major scale, okay? Because the ancient Greeks, they wrote Pythagoras, all these guys, Plato, Aristotle, they wrote a lot about how music can affect the emotions as well as our morality and our ethics and what we believe. They made music, they recognized that music had a very strong impact on you as a human being, in your mental state, your emotional state. So I want you to write down what emotion comes to mind for these different modes. I'm just going to play modes of the major scale, in part because that's the scale that most of us are most familiar with. So here we go. I'm all going to do it off the same bass note, so that stays the same. But here we go. Here comes a mode. I want you to just at home or in the chat write down a feeling that comes to mind. Now I recognize that there's a lot more that goes into creating emotion than just the pitches and the scale. That's one aspect. The rhythm, the timbre of the instrument, the melodic shape, all of those things go into creating emotion. This is one of the reasons why music is so awesome, because of the variety possible. But just focusing on those pitches, does anyone have an emotion that comes to mind? Just think about that, okay? What emotion would that feel like? Or does it make you, what does it make you feel, or what does it make you think about? And let's try a different one. Let's try a second one. Just for those of you who are doing a little ear training at home, what I just played for you was the Mixolydian mode. That was the Mixolydian mode. So number 1, Mixolydian. So I'm going to play another mode, and feel free to jot down at home or in the chat how this one makes you feel. I mean, that feels definitely different from me. And someone wrote optimism. I can absolutely see optimism for that. That was the Lydian mode. The Lydian mode. And I think optimism is a great optimism. And there's more than one, right? There's more than one right answer here. For music, some people like to say that there's no wrong answers. That's incorrect. There are wrong answers. But there's more than one right answer. So we can't say that anything goes, but we can't say that there's only one right answer either. It's more complicated than that. Let's try another mode. Let me give you a third option. Let's see if you can come up with another emotion, word for an emotion. See how this one's different. That definitely feels very different to me. Again, these are all using the same collection of pitches. But that was Aeolian, which is our normal minor scale. There's something very haunting about that mode and that scale, especially when you're not raising the leading tone and you're keeping it modal. How about another one? Another one. That was a Phrygian scale. A Phrygian scale. Now, someone just asked in the chat, Aeolian is just minor, right? So just minor. This is our natural minor scale. Phrygian is also a minor mode. So we break up the different modes into whether they're a minor mode or a major mode. In the case of Phrygian and Aeolian, because both of them have a minor third, they are considered minor modes. Lydian and Mixolydian are considered major modes. So let's see. Keep in mind that Locrian is often considered, for a long time was considered just a theoretical mode because it has a diminished fifth. And so, in the early Middle Ages, they didn't really use Locrian. Most music wants that perfect fifth because that power of that fifth, circle of fifths, all that kind of thing. That acoustic phenomenon is so critical. So Locrian mode tends to be more theoretical mode until later on composers start experimenting with it and figuring out how to use it. So I've done 4 out of the 7 modes, keeping in mind that Ionian is just our major scale, just as Aeolian is just the minor scale. Ionian is just the major scale. But left is Dorian, Ionian, and Locrian. Which one is this, and what does it feel like? Which mode is this? That was the Dorian mode. That was the Dorian mode right there. And another feeling. And then finally, if we just play so I can complete it, I got the other 2. That would be the Locrian mode, both a diminished fifth and a minor second in it. And last but not least, I keep playing that chromatic passing tone. I love it so much. Sorry. Our Ionian mode. So I can kind of give you my, how I interpret those emotions and the different kinds of emotions. Because as I said, there's more than one. There's a certain range that each one of these modes can capture, right? And certain modes are better at capturing certain feelings than other modes. But I think what's important is for the composers, the improvisers out there, to really give some thought to how they feel and how they're different. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to answer some more questions, but and maybe I should. Maybe how do the different modes feel? Maybe I should actually give you some stuff. I like optimism for Lydian. I think that's great. I think sad, right? Happy. That's certainly some of them. They're the kind of cliche. If I were to say, let me just. Mixolydian often makes me feel like purposeful. Lydian, optimistic. Aeolian, sad. Phrygian, flamboyant, but in a dramatic sort of way. Dorian. Feels very serious. Feels serious. Locrian. Otherworldly. I'm just throwing up, and these are just some. There's many, many more, and so I think it would be great to have like a list, have a chart with maybe 5 different emotions for each one out there to really see if you can zero in, because like there's different ways to be flamboyant. This is more of a serious flamboyance, like you're flamboyant, dramatic, like not to be too cliche, but like a bullfighter. So Phrygian mode, Spanish bullfight, the big cape, it's serious business. There's a bull with horns coming at you, but there's a lot of flamboyance involved as well. So I hope that was shed some light on modes, on scales, and if you want to learn more about them, I have some other videos up on modes. You can kind of look them up. So let me turn back here to the chat, see if we got some other questions I'd be happy to answer. All right. Give me a second here. Octatonic, someone say, so Danny's asking, is it possible to maybe brush upon the octatonic scale and how they might relate to other scales and modes? Seems a little hazy to me. That's a great question. So the octatonic scale. Octatonic, octopus, 8. 8 is the number when we think about that. So let's see what we can put together for you all. And I'm looking, there it is. So octatonic scale. So let me just write out C, D flat, E flat, E, F sharp, G, A, B flat, C. So this is half step, whole step, half step and harmonically, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step. Now, you need to write you need to go enharmonic at a few spots, because if you were to just do it without that, so let's say half step, whole step, half step, then I need to do a whole step, so it would be a G something, it would have to be a G, so it would be G flat, I guess, right? And then when I get here, I'd have to be an A double flat, and then B, because that's going to be, so the F flat is enharmonically the E, the G flat is enharmonically the F sharp, the A double flat is enharmonically the G, the B double flat is the A, and then we get to C, but we need a B flat, right? So it's like, at some point, these letters work great for 7-note scales. They don't work great for 8-note scales. So I specifically chose to just have you're going to have 2 letters, 2 of the same letters in a row in an octatonic scale. I chose to do it right here at the E flat and E natural. But you can see that the pattern for an octatonic scale is alternating half steps and whole steps. So this is actually called a symmetrical scale because unlike doing, so modes don't work so well with this scale, because if you say, well, if you remember what we were talking about, we're saying, well, what are the intervals above the bass? So you would say, okay, minor second, let's say minor third, major third, augmented fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, minor 7, right? So that's your intervals of a bass. Let's say we started on, instead, the E flat, okay? The intervals above that bass would be minor second, minor third, or in this case, you could say augmented second, which is enharmonically the same. So I'll write it as the enharmonic. So actually, E flat to E would be, you call that a, let me go with the enharmonics, because it doesn't make sense to do it otherwise. So E flat to E is enharmonically a minor second. E flat to G to F sharp is enharmonically a minor third. E flat to G is a major third. E flat to A is an augmented fourth. E flat to B flat is a perfect fifth. E flat to C is a major 6. E flat to D flat is a minor 7. So although you have to do some enharmonic spelling, you'll see that the collection of intervals above the bass for starting on C and E flat are exactly the same. Since they're exactly the same, they don't feel different. So it's not like the other modes. With a major scale, every single mode has a different, different collection of intervals above the bass. It's different for each one. Whereas for octatonic scales, that's not the case. If you were to start on F sharp, it would be the exact same formula of minor second, minor third, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major 6, minor 7. If you were to start on A, it would be exactly the same. So C, E flat, F sharp, A, you can't really talk about them as being different modally because they have the same intervals above that modal center. The only things that are different is if you were to start on the D flat, E, G, or B flat, right? And then what happens is what all the half steps turn into whole steps and all the whole steps turns into half steps. So off of D flat, we would get, instead of the minor seconds, we get major second. Then we get, we would call it enharmonically a minor third. We then get a perfect fifth, a perfect fourth rather. We then get a diminished fifth enharmonically, minor 6 enharmonically, a major 6, and a major 7. Did I do that right? Let me just make sure. Major second, minor third, perfect fourth, diminished fifth, minor 6. Yeah, so this is the intervalic makeup for if we started on the other note. So that's your octatonic scale. And so what's interesting is there's really only 3 different ones, right? You start on C, you start on C sharp, you start on D, and then after that, once you start on E flat, you're basically playing this scale again. So when people talk about learning your major scales and you got 12 different major scales you got to learn, when you need to learn your octatonic scales, you only really need to learn 3 and then realize that because they're symmetrical, they kind of repeat themselves after that. So a C octatonic scale starting with a half step is the same as an E flat starting with a half step, same as an F sharp starting with a half step, same as an A starting with a half step. So when we talk about octatonic scales, very often you differentiate them by saying whether the scale starts with a whole step or a half step. So like we were saying, if we start on D flat, then the scale starts with a whole step and you get major second, minor third, etc., etc. If you start on the C and it starts with a half step, then you get a minor second, minor third, etc., etc. So that's a little bit more in depth with octatonic scales. All the Claude Debussy and composers of the late 19th century, early 20th century were experimenting with scales like this. Got another question here from Abner. If I had any worksheets or something that I could maybe pay for or use to put into practice with all your music theory videos. So here's what I always recommend to folks. Let me just pull it off of my bookshelf. You really have a couple of options. And you can buy these on Amazon for, you get a old used edition, you're in good shape. So I should get royalties from this publishing company, from McGraw-Hill, but Tonal Harmony, Koska and Payne, this is a textbook. At the end of every chapter, they have a self-test. And so you can see these self-tests. And then at the very back of the book, it has an answer key for the self-tests. So you can kind of go to the back and there you go, you got some answers. So this is I think probably the best way to do it. If you want to do more, you can get and this is from a different edition than the text I just held up, but it's the same book, Total Harmony by Koska and Payne. And this is a set of worksheets. The problem here is there's no answer sheet. So it's a great to test yourself, but you don't have a way to check your work. So that's why I recommend the actual textbook that has the self-test with answers in the back. The other book that I recommend is Paul O'Harder, though I think the newer editions are by someone else. It's called Harmonic Materials and Tonal Music. What's nice about these is they have a question on one side, answers on the other side. So you kind of have to cover up one side or the other and do that. I do not currently have my own set of worksheets and materials. It's something like very similar to my answer for the music history idea of having some music history videos. I love to do that. I want to do that. It's a matter of making the time to do something like and make that happen. But again, I appreciate you all asking because it makes me know that would be useful to you all. And I definitely would. I've worked out of a lot of different books. The ones I recommended, I think, are the ones I suggest you use now. But there's other books I've read, and if I were to put my own materials together, it would be a combination of all the different music theory books that I've read, that I've used, along with my own kind of approach to trying to simplify and essentialize that material in a really nice step-by-step process. So at some point, I'm going to develop those, and those are going to be really valuable. So stay subscribed to Dr. B Music Theory, because at some point it's going to happen. But thank you for asking. I got someone wishing me a happy holiday season. Well, thank you very much. Can we make a counterpoint with this kind of scale? Absolutely. So here the question is, can we make a counterpoint with these kinds of scales? Absolutely. So this is what's really neat. So counterpoint is really where you're just basically taking a melody and another melody that kind of works. They work together. So you're having two different melodies that work together harmonically, rhythmically, melodically, in all those respects. And so every one of these modes has its own unique character, its own unique feeling, as I was talking about, and melodic shapes. So where those half steps fall is really important. The difference between a half step and a whole step. And half steps have a certain direction. So this is, and by that I mean, if we think about the ascending melodic scale, minor scale, half step, right? That half step drives us up. And when we go down, now the half step is from scale degree 6 to scale degree 5. So the half step drives you in certain directions, right? Half step going into a kind of like a structural point in that scale, the fifth, the tonic, 1 or 5. If you have a half step that goes to one of those notes, you want it to go in that direction. So there's a certain, if you're going to be writing counterpoint, I think the big thing that's different than, let's say, using counterpoint for a traditional major scale or minor scale is that some of the melodic shapes are going to have to be different because the half steps are in different places. And think about the ascending versus the descending melodic minor scale and why you want to raise that leading tone so that it's closer to tonic. It pulls you up. And why on the way down, and I'm going to write this out because I don't want to go too fast. And I know that some of what I'm saying, if you haven't watched all my videos already, some of this might go a little bit over your head. And I don't want too much of that to happen, but if we think about this, so we have I'm making our ascending melodic minor scale, right? Because C is tonic, it's a critical focal point, a structural point, the modal center of that scale. We want that half step to be as close to that note. We don't want that to be a B flat. That's too far away. We want to make it even closer because that half step feels like it's going to pull us up to our center, as opposed to if it was a B flat, it's not pulling us up that way. Now, when we go down the scale, we have the B flat because we don't need to be pulled up to C. We're going away from it. We're falling away from it. We want to be pulled down. We want to pull down the scale. And so we have our A flat, and our G is another big structural point. It's the scale degree 5. So scale degree 1, scale degree 5, these are big focal points. Scale degree 3 is another big point, focal point, right? But most important focal point, second most, and final, right? In terms of order of their like gravitational pull in our scale solar system, if we're going to make that analogy. But you'll see right here, here's our half step, the A flat to the G. That A flat just slips down to that area. Just as we wanted the B natural to pull us up to the C, we want the A flat to pull us down to the G. So when you're thinking about writing counterpoint using modes, all the same principles apply in terms of having the melodies. Each of those melodies have their own unique, good melodic qualities in terms of if you have a leap, you step back in the opposite direction. There's one focal point for every phrase. So you're not just repeating a bunch of high notes in a row that makes it feel very static. So all those rules still apply, but the melodic contours and shapes will have to vary. So if you aren't doing this B natural to C and you're doing the B flat, you're going to want to recognize that you're doing something different. And so it doesn't mean you'll necessarily do it less, but you'll do it differently. If I have a minor 7, let's say I'm playing in a mode like a Dorian mode, that 7 to 6 is a nice way to land on the 6. And I'm going to end on that. I'm going to focus in on the F, and I might focus on that G more because that's what distinguishes it from Aeolian in the natural minor, which is what we expect. So I try to make sure I'm drawing attention to the aspects that are unique about each one of those modes, and kind of thinking about where the half steps fall in terms of where there's going to have a certain rhythmic weight, longer duration. So those are the things to consider as you're writing that. So thank you, Quebec. Great question. Good. Yeah, I'm here in the chat looking at the emotions again that we were talking about. You know, Anup, you make a really interesting comment here, and I'm going to just draw some attention. I'm going to read it. You said, I not only need to learn music properly, but need to learn to feel it properly as well. You know, that's an excellent point, right? So let's just think about this, right? It's not all these things aren't self-evident. It takes some introspection and some reflection. Let's take a second here and think about how many people are in the world who are completely mixed up and completely conflicted on how they feel. You know, there's people who are on all sorts of pills because they're not feeling right. There's people who are self-medicating, whether that's having a glass of wine or way too many glasses of wine, or having a giant piece of cake with lots of sugar or whatever else, right? You know, all of this, you know, there's a lot of people who feel conflicting emotions and who are kind of, you know, love-hate relationship, if you want to give some examples. So one, as a human being, to connect our thinking with our feelings as tightly, to build as many bridges between the two as possible, is something that as a human being, we all are striving to do better. And I draw the analogy in music and in music theory, right? Like if you're just thinking about stuff and not feeling it, it's probably going to be really boring music. And if you're just feeling stuff and you're not thinking about it, chances are that inspiration is going to die out eventually, and it's just going to get clunky. We really need the best of both. We need the thinking, the theory, the intellect, and we need the feeling. You know, too many people think that it's one or the other. It's not. It has to be both. All the great musicians have at least some combination of that. And the more complicated the music gets, the more critical it is that they both get connected. there's absolutely music out there in the world that is not so good on the feeling, but really well thought out. And we've got a lot of music out there that's got a lot of feelings, but it's not well thought out, and so it kind of like a one-hit wonder, right? You got the feeling once, but you've got no variety because you're just going on just this one mode of feeling. So I think what you're saying there is like you got to learn music properly, but you gotta develop the emotional awareness and sensitivity to feel it properly. And this is in the Baroque era. There was a lot of people writing about music, talking about that the most important thing for a musician was to develop good taste. Good taste, to be able to tell the difference between good quality and bad. And part of that is the feeling. Does it capture a feeling? And so this is actually a really big, this is a really big question that expands into the areas of psychology and philosophy, and there's been a lot of people who've written a lot of words about this. And I think you're absolutely right. It's something you got to practice at. And I'll be honest, I've definitely, the way I was taught music was definitely with an emphasis on the intellectual side of things. I mean, I'm calling it Dr. B music theory because that's the strength. It's not Dr. B feelings. I'm trying to build that in because I'm recognizing that the way I was taught, the emphasis was all on the theory side, and nobody ever said anything about how it feels. It was never even discussed in a music theory class. And I think there's something wrong with that. I think you have to start thinking about how the theory creates the feeling, and not just kind of like on a gut level. Like if you can start intellectualizing it as well. I don't think intellectualizing it has to mean that you then lose the feeling. I think they both can live together symbiotically. So yeah, and you and me both, we're on that continuum together on figuring out how we can learn the music properly and feel it properly so that we actually are getting it. Because think about it, I remember hearing a story from one of my students, one of my saxophone students, saying that a previous teacher, he would play something for a previous teacher, and that teacher would say, he'd say, well, how did I do? He said, well, is that the way you really felt it? Because if that's the way you felt it, who am I to say that what you played was wrong? And I thought to myself, wow, that sounds like really bad teaching. Because when you say, is that the way you really feel something? I mean, that assumes that the student is actually able to accurately identify their emotions. And there's a reason that we have psychologists and psychotherapists, because so many of us have a hard time actually knowing how we feel after all the fear and whatever other emotions that are going in play. And sometimes we feel contradictory things or multiple things in multiple levels. So to simply say, if that's the way you feel it, who am I to question it? I don't think it's very useful. I think we have to remember that we're trying to become people who aren't feeling conflicting emotions about things, so that you actually can go forward with confidence and say, how do you feel about this? I feel this, whatever that is. But to be able to have that clear sense of emotion. And I think some of the greatest composers, like a Rachmaninoff or a Tchaikovsky, they have a very clear idea of what emotion they're trying to express. And they feel it in all its reality. Some people go through life in a haze. They don't really know what they're feeling. They have these vague pictures of like general feelings, but they don't specifically crystal clear know how they even feel within their own mind, body, and soul. But I think some of the great composers, they did. Like, I think Beethoven really felt like crap when he started going deaf, and he felt terrible, and he wanted to kill himself. He was very clear in how he felt. And when he decided that there was still something to live for in life, and he said, you know what, I'm not going to be defeated by being deaf. I'm going to figure out how to keep composing music and take music to a whole new level. I think he was very, very clear in that feeling. I don't think he was like, I'm kind of wishy-washy. Yeah, I go back and no, I think Beethoven was the kind of person who would clearly feel both the tragedy and the despair, as well as the triumph that would go in there. So I think we all need to kind of keep that in mind as we grow as musicians as well as people. All right, enough of that. We talked about our Dorian mode, so that's awesome. Hyper modes. Okay. So Danny Pippin's asking about hyper modes. I think what you really mean is hypo modes. So not hyper, but hypo. So you have this is coming from the ancient Greeks, and that's our foundation for all the music theory we're talking about. The ancient Greeks were awesome. They came up with tons of amazing stuff that are part of what we're doing now in our culture. So they came up with something that's withstood the test of time. Let's put it that way. So you have mixolydian and you have hypomixolydian, and what hypo does is it changes the range. So this is something that I haven't really talked much about, but it is something that was considered by the Greeks, and I think is certainly valid. Is that, and I don't know it well enough off the top of my head, so I'm going to give you some examples, but I don't want you to hold me to them being exactly this. I understand the basic concept, but not the specifics. So this is, the reason I haven't put out the music history is I don't want to misspeak if I kind of have the basic idea but not the exact aspects. So let's take a look. Here's what I would say. So you might have, I think, for example, the Greeks might call this the mixolydian mode, and they would call so what they would do is they would have what they would call, I don't know if they call it the final, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. And it's not called the reciting tone, but it's kind of like what it was when you talk about psalm tones in the Middle Ages. So they have like, the primary, the modal center, and then the kind of like the dominant. What would be the dominant, like what's the second most important note? And so the idea is that for a mode, you'd have a collection of pitches, and then you'd have what would be do, as well as what would be the dominant. And in the hypo modes, they would have the same final, right? So this would be like hypomixolydian. And I know it's not called the reciting tone, but that's what I'm going to call it for now. But it's like the secondary focus. So if you look, and I think this is what they would call it. They would call this one mixolydian, and they would call this one hypomixolydian. Now, I'm sure there's a great Wikipedia article out there that will do better justice than I am doing right here. But I do, since you asked, I want to give you as much as I have to offer. So you'll notice that the things that make it mixolydian is that final is G, that's your modal center, that you got that collection of pitches, and around that collection of pitches, it's a major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, minor seven, right? Like that's the intervallic scalar makeup. You'll notice that the secondary focal point in this case is actually what we would today call the dominant. But with the hypo mode, it's different. But the range is different, right? So the idea in the hypo modes is that the melodies go beneath that note a lot more. So if I were to play this on the piano, right? That would be mixolydian mode. Because I'm focusing on that G, I'm playing everything above that note, up the scale, and I'm playing the D as a secondary focal point. Hypomixolydian might sound like this. Right? So I don't go above the D here, but I do go down to the D, and work my way back up to the G, and I put a little extra emphasis on the B here. So I think that's some of the fundamentals of what goes into the hypo modes. The range changes, so what the lower note and the higher note are, and then the secondary focus changes a little bit as well. And that's what distinguishes Mixolydian mode from hypomixolydian. They have Ionian, hypoionian. This is stuff I didn't know about until I went to a library and started opening up books on modal theory, and I thought I knew my modes, and I was like, what are they talking about? And there's a lot more complexity in there because all those things play into the emotion. What notes are being emphasized makes a difference. So good question. All right, we got people loving today's topic. I'm glad to hear it. Everybody loves modes. Modes are just such a cool sounding thing, and it's because there's so many different varieties of emotional flavor there, and you can hear it in the music of the great classical composers. You can hear it in the music of the Beatles and pop rock groups. You can hear it in jazz, of the music of like Miles Davis and Bill Evans and John Coltrane. These mode, and you can hear it in the ethnic musics of different cultures. It's like it's why people love like international food fairs, where it's like we all love food, right? Fat, carbohydrates, protein, mix it all up, put in some different spices. We love all the different, all those different permutations on the flavors, and that's kind of what modes are like. All right, keeping going here. Danny is making a good observation here that the octatonic scales is somewhat similar to the whole tone scales, and you're absolutely right there, Danny. As we mentioned for the, let's say, and I'm going to start with a octatonic scale, starting with the whole step this time, just for variety, right? Just so that I'm giving as much different options for you all to think about, right? So this is my, I wrote the wrong letter under this. I said I was going to start with a whole step. So whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, and harmonically, we know, right? Oh no, this should be a B natural. That was my mistake. Whole step, half step, right? And so because of that, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, if I start on any one of these, you can see the formula is going to stay the same. With a whole tone scale, C, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, let's call it B flat, you're going to skip one letter, right? We got a whole step, whole step, whole step, whole step. This is enharmonically a whole step. And we go back to C, whole step. So what that means is, like, if you were to go, well, what is a D whole tone scale? You just start on the note D. It's going to be like, so. How does that differ from the notes in the D whole tone scale? It doesn't. They're exactly the same notes. Or an E whole tone scale? Exactly the same notes. F sharp whole tone scale? Exactly same notes. You get the idea, right? So the whole tone scale is you have, this is really the C whole tone, D whole tone, E, F sharp, G sharp, B flat whole tone scale. So that gives you 6 of the scales. That means there's only another 6. So if I go to, I'm going to write it right here. Let's say D flat, E flat, F, G, A, B, D flat. That's a whole step, whole step, whole step, whole step, whole step, and harmonically whole step. Now I have, there's really only 2 different whole tone scales. And by different, I mean a different collection of pitches. This covers 6 of them. This covers 6 of them. For diminished, there's actually 3 variations. There's really 3 different kinds of diminished scales. And diminished scale is a synonymous This means the same thing as octatonic scale. Actually, not exactly the same. Octatonic means 8-note scale. This diminished scale is the most common octatonic scale, and so that has that name. So you're absolutely right. And so I know I'm doing that a little fast, and it might take a little while for you to wrap your heads around it, but if you were to play that on the piano and just be like, okay, I'm going to play my whole tone scale in all 12 keys, or all 15 keys, let's say, if you're going to do enharmonic keys. I think once you're about halfway through, you're going to be like, wait a minute. This is kind of the same thing, and you're going to notice, you'll hear and feel for yourself those similarities. So Danny's saying that he will definitely spend some time with that on the keyboard, and that's how you're really going to cement this knowledge. Hearing me talk about it, that's a great way to start. Playing it on the keyboard, that's how you cement it. Yeah, Elton, I haven't forgotten it. Love theme from Cinema Paradiso. I have not forgotten. Thanks for the reminder. Okay, let's see where we are. Okay. So old Tinho is writing here that he thinks that Mozart started to feel crap towards his end days. Well, he certainly died because he was sick, and he died young, right? So, I mean, the movie Amadeus is not 100% historically accurate, like most movies are not about musicians. Some are take more liberties than others, but there's at least the mythology is that he wrote a requiem, which is a mass for the dead, like what you would play for a funeral. And you have texts like Day of Wrath, Day of Reckoning, and you're setting words like that to music. And that he was composing a requiem for a patron, and that he felt like he was writing his own funeral song. At least that's how the stories go. I don't know, that might be a little bit of Hollywood mythology or something even before Hollywood that was doing something similar. But, the most famous part, the Lacrimosa from Mozart's Requiem, at least in the movie Amadeus, that's a very powerful scene where everyone's out in the rain, and he's so poor that he's got like he's put in a reusable coffin because he can't afford to buy his own coffin, so it's like you just put some in the coffin and then it has a little flap. Out he goes into what was called a pauper's grave, meaning for poor people who couldn't afford their own grave. So instead of digging your own hole and putting one body in the hole, you dig a giant hole and you put a bunch of dead bodies in there, and then you eventually bury up all of those bodies because it was less expensive, and if you couldn't afford to pay someone to dig that hole for you, what were your options? So the idea of Mozart feeling like crap towards the end of his life, he kind of didn't die he wasn't like feeling great, had a heart attack and was dead. He was sick for an extended period of time, and during that time he was writing a requiem. It's interesting to see the biographical stories of some of these great composers and the stories behind the pieces they wrote. Pranav, all right. Here's another question. A 6/4 inversion is a decoration to the 5 chord, or it's a separate second inversion of a chord? So I think I know where this question is going, and let me answer this. This one's complicated in the sense that it can occur. The answer is it can be either one of those. There's more than one right answer here, or there's more than one use of when you see 6/4 as an inversion. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about those differences to see if we can clarify this question, because music theory textbooks differ on how they handle this. So I'm going to use treble clef. I'm going to make C major. And I'm just going to write it out in like little block chords here. All right, so if we were to analyze this, we would say that's a C major triad, because C, E, G. G, B, D is a G major triad. E, G, C, that's another C major triad. There are two ways that this would be analyzed in music theory textbooks. One is to call this a 1-6-4 chord to a 5 chord, and if we use this as an inversion, 1-6. Okay? So with this analysis, they're saying that C, E, G with G as the lowest note is a second inversion 1 chord. Other music theory textbooks will call this 5-6-4, 5, 1-6. So in this case, they are not saying that this is a G major triad in second inversion. So here, the 6-4 is referring to like non-chord tones or intervals above the bass. Above the bass. Or as Pranav said, decoration. So consider this the decoration analysis. All right? This 6-4 is saying it's a second inversion of a triad. So this is why it's tricky and why it's understandable that people get confused. So the thing you'll notice that everybody agrees that 6-4 should be used, right? And the reason is that when we're talking about 6-4, we're talking about figured bass. Figured bass is simply the intervals above the bass. Intervals above the bass. So the bass is a G. We're saying 6 and 4. The E is a 6 above the bass. The C is a 4 above the bass. The thing that's different is, well, how is it functioning? How is it functioning? Where is this emphasis? This analysis is saying we're going to analyze it based on the triadic level of individual chords. Whereas this is saying that this entire 2 chords function as a dominant. That this is all essentially a G chord, and that incidentally it's a C major triad in second inversion, but that's just the embellishment. It's not the function. So we're going to call it 5, and the 6-4 is the decoration, the embellishment, the non-chord tones above the bass that are eventually going to resolve and just be a regular 5 chord. So I kind of feel that my explanation is like 95% clear. Everything I'm saying is correct, but I have that feeling that it's not as precise as it could be in answering that question. So I hope that you're able to bridge that 5% that I'm missing in terms of my explanation. But I think the fundamental answer to your question is that 6-4 is always going to be intervals above the bass, figured bass. It's the Roman numeral part that changes, and sometimes it's going to mean second version of a triad, and sometimes it's going to mean these are non-chord tones, embellishments, and decorations. And you have to kind of look at the larger context to figure out which one it is. Realizing that even music theory textbooks today disagree on whether it should be 1-6-4-5-1-6 or 5-6-4-5-1-6. There's disagreement. And usually, and to clarify, they often, if they're going with this 5-6-4 to 5, they usually don't reintroduce the 5 as that. They put a hyphen, so they go 6 moving to 5, 4 moving to 3. So 6-5, 4-3. So this 6-4 is indicating non-chord tones. something that's not in there. That's what gets tricky. This is important when you start analyzing suspensions. So when we start to talk about like a 9/8 suspension or a 7/6 suspension or 4/3, like what do those numbers mean? They're intervals above the bass, and some of those numbers are non-chord tones. They don't always mean inversions of a bass. And 6/4 does not always mean second inversion of a triad. So you have to look, it gets more complicated. So I hope that answers at least 95% of what you were hoping to get. Great question. So I got a question here about the using of augmented intervals is useful in some types of music, but in Western music, they don't. And you're absolutely right. So let me just step to the side in case anyone wants to pause this after the fact, if they're re-watching it. Let's talk about the augmented second. So you're absolutely right, and I'm not quite sure, I don't know if that was a spelling, the Macam music. I'm not familiar with that, or whether that's but the augmented second, as I mentioned, is so critical in all of these gypsy scales. Often, like also Jewish scales will have that augmented second in it. But Western, and by Western music, we're talking about specifically, culturally, from ancient Greece, so like 500 BC, to the Roman Empire, to the rise of Catholicism, and then going into the Middle Ages, into the Renaissance. And geographically, we're talking about Greece, going to Italy, spreading to what's France, what's going to become Germany, though it was not Germany back at this time, and then to a certain extent all the way to England, and then to a minor degree, Spain. And so this is kind of like our Western culture tradition here. And the reason I put a little caveat with Spain is that Spain was influenced both by Western music coming from ancient Greece, Rome, and Italy as being the cultural center early on, but they had a lot of Arabic influences coming up from northern Africa. And so the North African Arabic, so the Arabs came from the Middle East, came into Africa, north of Africa, and then up into Spain. So you have those Arabic musical influences coming in through Spain and mixing with Western music. It's really interesting stuff, but it's a mixture of those traditions. Whereas Italy, France, and what's going to become Germany, and England has a little bit of the kind of like that's where you have like a Celtic influence into music. So there's some influences there, but Italy, France, all of them have their own kind of other influences, but you do have this Western music tradition, goes all the way back to ancient Greece, then to Italy, to France, Germany, England, Spain, to varying degrees. In Western music, they avoid the augmented second. They say, no, thank you. They don't like that's not part of their sound. Whereas in a gypsy music or in some other Arabic music, other things, the augmented second is featured prominently. So the question of why is going to have to trace back to what is the difference between those two cultures in terms of what feelings they think are important. Let me say that again. What feelings they think are most important. So there are people who their number one goal is they work a job they don't love and they look forward to getting totally drunk and going out and dancing all weekend. That's the feeling they want. And there's other people who don't want that feeling, right? So even if we think about individuals, there's people who want different feelings as a part of their life. The same is going to be true for cultures. What feeling are we going into? And I haven't given this a ton of thought. So if you think about traditional music theory and what I talk about, well, we say augmented seconds, like, you know, when you raise the leading tone in minor, you can't go from scale degree 6 to raised leading tone, you know, leaving 6 as normal and going to the raised leading tone, because then you get the augmented second, and it gives it this kind of like kind of like a tweak feeling. It makes your head twitch a little bit, right? It's got this little this kind of feeling. It's a different feeling, and I got it. Like I was saying earlier, I got to work on getting in touch with my feelings. How do I put into words what that feeling is? How is it different? Using just minor seconds and major seconds, there's a sense of flow. There's a sense of smoothness. There's a sense of like a smooth movement towards a goal, right? Which is very, very much kind of like a Western idea, very purposeful, very goal-oriented, and I think that has something to do with it. So the real answer is going to have to do with the philosophy, the ethics of these different cultures in terms of what's important. So, you know, it's like if in most Western culture, the idea of progress is very, very important, as opposed to being like, oh, I'm content with where we're at. I'm just going to maintain. That's not a particularly Western idea. And so I don't know enough about the other cultures to really say, well, analyze that aspect. I mean, there's ethnomusicology classes out there that I think would be fascinating to take and would help you answer these questions. But it's going to have to do with some of those areas in terms of what is that feeling in terms of that difference with the augmented second. If I play augmented seconds, they sound like they give me like a little twitch. It's not necessarily a bad thing, right? It's really interesting. It's like would be great for, like, if you think about the kind of dancing that you would expect, like Romanian folk dancing. This more angular. It's not ballet, right? It's not ballet. Ballet is so smooth. Romanian, you know, different kind of ethnic groups, their dancing is not as smooth and flowing, right? It's a different feeling. It's a different experience. So I know that's not a great answer, but that's at least, I think, where those are some of the questions you need to be asking to come up with the real answer. Why is the motion of 5 to 4, why is that bad? Pranav, that's a great question. So here's what I can tell you. Western music is very much goal-oriented. It's not about, you know, there's a reason why Buddhist monks sitting and meditating for hours and hours is a thing that doesn't really happen in Western culture, or is not normally considered. This idea of just sitting and becoming one with nature, this is not a very Western idea. Western music likes the ideas of having a goal, progress, and so that translates. These philosophical ideas translate and are reflected in the music. And 5 going to 4 does not feel like progress. You know, 5 going to 1, that feels like a progression. 5 to 4, it's not that it sounds bad. I mean, I guess let me again, since you're asking me, you think you're asking me music theory questions, but you're really asking me philosophical questions, because you're saying, why is it bad? Bad is good and bad are moral qualifiers, right? So it all depends what you're saying your morality. If goal-oriented, achieving of goals and progress are what's the right thing to do, the right moral thing to do, then 5 to 4 is the right progression. And 5 to 4 is bad. But if that's not your thing, if you're like, listen, I'm kind of like gonna stay in a place and just kind of like sit with something and just live with it, then 5 to 4 is totally fine, right? If we think about a blues, this is the 4 chord, 4, Back to 5. 5, 4, 1. But there. Right? It feels like 5, shift to the 4. It's a shift. It's not a progression. It's not a moving forward, right? But keep in mind, the blues is a function of Western music combining with aspects of African music. It's two different cultures and it's melding. So it's more of like, well, what feeling are you going for? What context or what style you're trying to write? If you are trying to write music that feels like Western music, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, then 5/4 doesn't feel right. And if you just throw it in there, every now and then, it's going to feel wrong. It's going to feel out of place. But if you say, listen, I'm embracing this kind of shift feeling of 5 going to 4, and I'm getting a different feeling in there, then it's going to work. It's a matter of, and I had a composition student, and at one point he was basically in C major, and at one point his cadence went. He went from a G with an F sharp to C. But it was the only time he had the F sharp. Everything else was diatonic. And I was like, listen, when you do one thing that's unusual just once, it sounds like a mistake or it sounds random. You need to develop a system of like, well, if you're going to do something unusual, you get the customary recommendation is do it more than once. A mistake is a note that doesn't fit that happens once. If you do that same note that doesn't fit a couple times, then all of a sudden it's something different. It's not a mistake. So you have to kind of do things more than once, and above and beyond that, because that's not sufficient. You have to kind of say, well, what's the system? Why am I doing this unusual thing, and how do I make it work? So 5/4 is only bad if you are trying to write music that feels like it is going goal-oriented, making progress, and or trying to emulate a style of one of these classical composers. If that's not your goal, then 5/4 does not sound bad, right? So it's a tricky question, but thank you for asking it. Here's another question here. What difference would it make if I tune all my instruments as A432? I discovered lately that my tuner allows to do so, so it is just standard pitch, or is it something deeper meaning than that? Woo! Anup, you're asking so many good questions today. All of these are like great questions, and I feel like each one of them deserves a lot more time than you're going to get. But I'm going to start because it's a great question. So, in the United States, not in every country, and I'll speak for the United States because this is where I live, 440 hertz is what we tune A. That's our A. I do not know how we decided that was the number. What I do know is that when I went to France to give some master classes and some performances, they used something higher than 440. They used like 443 maybe. I'm not quite sure, but it was higher. And sometimes that can create problems for certain instruments. So for example, on a saxophone, and I'll just, since I have it still out, right? The way I tune is I pull in or push out this mouthpiece. So if I pull it out, the pitch goes down because the instrument's longer. If I push this in, it goes up in pitch because the instrument's shorter. Shorter instruments, smaller instruments, higher pitch. Now the problem is, if I'm usually tuning here, there's a limit on how far I can push this mouthpiece in, right? At a certain point, it's too big. I can't push it in any farther. So if I'm in France and the tuning they go sharp from where they normally tune. At a certain point, I can't go as high because I didn't set my saxophone up. I didn't this cork here is too thick for me to push in all the way and get to the right pitch. And I remember when I went to France, it was like super heat wave, which makes the pitch go higher. So it was something like, it was in the, well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And it was hot. And in France, they don't have the number of buildings that have air conditioning is a smaller percentage than they do in the United States. So I was in a hot room, no air conditioning, and I'm like trying to push in my mouthpiece so that I can play with the piano, because they're tuning, it affects the tuning. So you have these different tunings within France, and I remember, some of the people I was performing with, they'd be like, what A do we want to use? Like, how high do we want to go? So there's a couple factors that go into this. So what are the factors that go into deciding, well, what A are we going to tune to? So let me point out, especially in Germany, when you had all these organs being built in the 17th century, they would not all be the same, tuned to the same A. Like, you go from village to village or town or city in Germany, and you play what looks like the note that's going to be an A on the keyboard, and they could be widely different pitches. And I think part of that had to do with, like, these were not, there wasn't a governmental agency saying that A has to be this many frequencies, or there wasn't a group of people who said, yes, we've all gotten together and we've decided A is going to be 438 cycles per second, right? Like, the technology might not have been quite there to have that kind of like easy precision for everybody. You didn't have kind of an overarching board or government dictating what that is going to be. And so you find that from organ to organ, especially in Germany, you have very different frequency pitch levels. So that's one thing that you got to keep in mind. The kind of like the standardization of tuning is something that that's evolved, and it's not standardized now, right? In France, they tune higher than we do in the United States. It's not standardized now. And it was much less standardized if you go back historically. The other is when we talk about violin instruments. And we're talking about the timbre in terms of the tension of the string. So the violin has its 4 strings, and you have open strings, meaning that you can't really change the pitch of those strings. If you tune to 443 versus 440, there's more tension on that string, and therefore the timbre, not only the pitch is slightly different, right? So the pitch goes up 3 cents or whatever, whatever the equivalent is, but the timbre changes. It gets a little bit more strident, a little bit more piercing when you tune a little bit higher. So it has to do with the timbral effect it has, especially for string instruments. So sometimes people will say, listen, I really like it when we tune to a lower A, because it makes the music, the tension of the timbre for these string instruments makes it feel darker and it blends it well. And then another piece, they say like, oh no, for this piece, I really want it to have this piercing quality, because the emotion of the pieces are different, right? So there's that argument on where you should tune it based on the timbral change you get on the instrument based on the tension on the string. So when you say you're tuning all your instruments to 432, if you're talking about string instruments, the timbre of your guitar will be different at 432 than 440. And depending on the emotion you want to capture with a piece, one timbre might be better than another. So I think those are the differences when you talk about the difference between 432 and 440, and sometimes you have like 446 in France. Like it can go up a lot higher, and it has to do with the timbre. This is the big thing, especially when you're dealing with string instruments in particular, and like in the case of my instrument, the saxophone, they're built, so they're actually saxophones that are called high pitch and low pitch saxophones, and they're meant to capture which one of these, because you lay out the tone holes differently and the tuning relationships become different. Tuning is just this, I mean, if you really want to go down a rabbit hole of like learning tons of interesting stuff, start learning about tuning system and acoustics, and think about, and then combine it with what I'm saying, which is the idea of timbre and how the timbre changes based on the tuning, especially for string instruments, and then how that translates to feeling and conveying a musical feeling. Those are all the differences and the things to consider. Yeah, and I have a tuner that allows me to tune different tuning systems. So I can do like Pythagorean tuning or just intonation, and I can tune on those different tuning systems, which is like mind-boggling. And I remember there's a Renaissance vocal group called the Tallis Scholars. They're based out of England. If you like music, you should at least listen to them. They're a group led by a gentleman named Peter Phillips, and they sing predominantly Renaissance music, so 16th, essentially 16th century music, some 15th century, and they don't sing in equal temperament tuning. They don't sing in the tuning system used for all the digital keyboards, pianos, and synths that are, you know, the basic pianos and so on. I mean, you can change that on the synths, but your basic, you know, keyboard that you're going to buy is going to be used with equal temperament tuning. They don't use that. And I went to a concert and I heard them sing, and I went up and I talked to him. I started talking to him about it. He said, you know, there's groups that they have singers that have, their ears are so good that they'll be like, you know, for this song we're going to use this tuning system, and for this other song we're going to use another tuning system, which is like mind-boggling to me that you would be that good, because the tuning is like, it's not like crazy different notes. It's not playing a different note. It's like being like, well, this one's going to be, well, it's going to be a little higher for this pitch, and when we do this tuning system, this note's going to be a little bit lower. That level, you know, it's kind of like the Olympics. These are like Olympians for tuning and ear sensitivity for that tuning. So if you listen to some of their music, I think you'll kind of start understanding what I'm talking about a little bit better. All right, what is subtonic and what's the role of it? That's a great question. So subtonic refers to scale degree 7 when it is not raised in a minor mode. So if we have a C, D, E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat, C, right? This is our natural minor scale. C is considered our tonic. D is called supertonic. Super meaning like above. So above tonic. The E flat is the median, called like the middle of the triad, C, E flat, G. It's the middle note. I'm going to skip over F for a second. The G is called the dominant, and that's because it's the secondary, like the second most emphasized note after tonic, so it's the dominant. Then the B flat, if you leave it like this, is called subtonic, meaning sub, below. So you have supertonic, above tonic, subtonic, below tonic. Now, very often in Western music, we're turning it into a B natural and calling it the leading tone. But in the natural minor scale, scale degree 7 would be called a subtonic. Now the second part of the question is like, how does it function? Well, it functions as a way to lead us down. So if we have so this would be 1 minor 5 chord with the subtonic in the bass, minor 5 chord, 4/6, this is the question, do you call this a 1/6/4 or 5/6/4 to 5/5/3? Right, but so that subtonic helps drive us down. It gives a darkness to the mode. It gives a feeling of like weightiness, Henry Purcell does great things with the subtonic. He's a composer English composer from the Baroque era. So that's kind of the role of the subtonic, is to lead things down and to keep a certain darkness in that minor key to add to it. So good question, thank you. Do I have a favorite mode or scale? You know, I don't. It's like I like so many different flavors and different kinds of food. So it's like, I had a friend who, we had a long conversation once on why eat anything other than chicken. He's like, chicken tastes great. Why would I eat anything else? Chicken's my favorite flavor. You can do so much with chicken. Why have anything else? He's like, chicken's the best meat. And we had this huge conversation. I was like, have you tried a steak, or maybe some fish, or some salmon maybe, or how about venison, or pork, and so he was the kind of person at that time where he liked one flavor and he just stuck with it. And I'm the kind of person who's like, oh, I want to try this, and next time I go to the restaurant, I'm going to try something different than I had before. I have my favorites. I really like things with lemon cakes, lemon cookies, anything like that. Love lemon and stuff, both sweet and savory. But in terms of modes, I kind of like, I like playing in all of them. So I guess if I were to say Locrian is probably not one of my favorites, just because it doesn't have that perfect fifth in it. So all on its own, it's not doesn't have as much things I can do with it. But it has its place where it really works great. I do use the Locrian mode when I compose and when I improvise. I love Dorian. I love Lydian. Lydian sound a lot. I love Mixolydian, Aeolian, and I do like using the ascending melodic minor modes a lot. I don't use harmonic minor modes a ton. I don't use a lot of the augmented second stuff that we were talking about. So I use more of the ascending melodic minor modes. Particularly the seventh mode of the ascending melodic minor, which is in jazz called the altered dominant scale. It works great on 5 chords with alteration. So if I'm playing on this kind of sound, that might, if I had to pick a favorite today, and it would probably change tomorrow, it would be the altered dominant 7th mode of the ascending melodic minor scale. So, and it's because I love playing that sound on dominant chords that have been altered. So this is the jazz musician side of me. If I see a C, let me write it out. A C7 sharp 5 flat 9, let's say, right? So this kind of chord, a very jazz chord, like that. I like to play C, D flat, D sharp, E, F sharp, G sharp, B flat, C. Which is, if I were to rewrite this, and I'm running out of my black marker, which I guess is good. It means we've covered a lot of great stuff. D flat, E flat, F flat. I'm going to rewrite it enharmonically so that you can see it. B flat, C, D flat. That's my D flat ascending melodic minor scale. So I would start on the note C, use those same pitches, and I get myself the scale, which is called the altered dominant scale, because this is essentially a dominant chord that has been altered, hence the name. So if I were to pick one of my favorite, that's my favorite for today. Why does Locrian always get overlooked is the question. I'm Iraqi, and classical Iraqi music is based on Locrian. It's pretty pleasing to listen to. You know, that's a great question, and it has to do with that so much music has this kind of like tonic dominant perfect fifth relationship. It's so much music, and it comes about because from an acoustical standpoint, if you have a note like a C and it's vibrating, this is called your fundamental. It has what's called overtones. It means that above that C, there's a C an octave higher that's also vibrating. You don't hear it. I mean, you do hear it. All right, let me say, you don't hear it as a pitch an octave higher. What you hear is a certain timbre of an instrument, right? So can you tell the difference between the sound of a saxophone playing a C and a trumpet playing a C, and a flute playing a C, and a guitar playing a C? All the same one, in the same octave. Can you tell the difference? If you can, it's because you are able to distinguish the different timbre of those instruments, meaning the different intensities of the overtones, right? So this is overtone like 1, 2, 3. Actually, let me do it so it lines up. 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So the different intensity of these overtones, you don't hear these pitches as distinct pitches. What you hear is it sounds different than another instrument. So let's say saxophone has, when you play this fundamental C, you hear the C and you've got 10% intensity on this note, 5% on this note, maybe 6% on this. I'm just making these numbers up. I don't know what it is. 15 on this and 4 on this, right? And that's what makes a saxophone sound. And by comparison, you might have a trumpet that sounds like and this might be the sound that makes it sound like a trumpet, right? These intensities of these overtones. The intensities of these overtones is what makes timbre, what makes the instrument sound different from each other. What makes me singing a pitch sound different than someone else singing. Like you can tell your favorite singer, you know, they sing the same note, you can tell the difference. Part of that is the timbre. And because this CG, right? The CG, and you have the G here, and you have the G here, and this is your fundamental, and you got the G here. This tonic dominant perfect fifth relationship is so fundamental to the sound of music that when you encounter a Locrian mode, which has no perfect fifth, it just seems very different, right? It's not jiving with that perfect fifth, that prominence of that perfect fifth that you find acoustically. So this is a Locrian scale, right? So we see that we have a minor second, a minor third, a perfect fourth, a diminished fifth, a minor sixth, and a minor seven, right? It's that the reason Locrian is overlooked. That's the why it's not used. Is because this relationship think about every heavy metal song that has it's parallel perfect fifths. It's like the fifth is like this kind of solidity, this kind of power. This mode does not allow you to get that feeling. Not easily, at least. It does not allow for that kind of that very like, we're going to go from here and then we're going to resolve, or we're going to have this kind of power. It doesn't have that feeling. And so, you know, that's super interesting to me in terms of Iraqi classical music using this Locrian scale, because there's not a lot of cultures that eschew that perfect fifth and use that Locrian sound. So my question then becomes, and this I don't know the answer to this, is so what is it about Iraqi culture, emotionally, philosophically, and what is it the feeling they're going for? Because they're not going for the same feeling. They're going for a different feeling. What is it, and why do they put that emphasis on it? And for me, I grew up in the United States, and after I graduated college, I spent a year living in Germany. And Germany it's a lot of German immigrants came to the United States, so there's a good amount of overlap culturally. But my goal when I went to Germany was I wanted to know why German music sounds German. What was it about the German people, their beliefs, their values that made German music sound like that? Why does German music sound so tough? Why is it like Beethoven, Brahms, Wagner? Like, it doesn't sound like Italian music. It doesn't sound like Heart on My Sleeve, Italian love song with drama. It's not like that. And it's not French. It's not colorful and quirky. Why does German music sound German? What is it about the German people? What are they valuing? And I remember it kind of hit me. Went into this museum. I came around this corner, and there was this sculpture of this person, like a leper or a beggar or something. But there was like the skin was all like diseased, and the body was all like twisted, but it was still standing. And I remember thinking, oh, and then I looked to my left, and there's like the crucifixion of, there's Christ, and it's got the cut on the side, right, where they cut him with the spear, and in most of the depictions of of a crucifix with Jesus that I saw, it would be a cut with like a little red line. In Germany, it was a flap of skin that was falling down, and the blood was like going down the entire leg, and the thorns from the crown of thorns was going into the head. And I was thinking to myself, whoa, these German people are like intense. I mean, it's like there's this muscular quality to German music. I've never been to Iraq. I'd love to go to Iraq. I'd love to go to Iraq and answer that same question. What makes Iraqi music sound Iraqi? What is it like? What is their mindset that makes it sound that way? So the Germans, like German barbarians, like fighting the Roman Empire, and like the sense of like German culture tends to be a little bit. They don't tend to express their emotions immediately like the stereotypical Italian would. It's a little bit more. If you want to go passive aggressive, go study a German, right? Great place to be passive aggressive. And then eventually that there's a break point. And there's like this toughness. Like Germans, I think, really value being strong and tough and stoic, and if you face life's burdens, you soldier on. You don't give up. You got to be tough. Like there's this kind of mindset. And Germans are also really, really into following rules. I remember going to this German village, and there's no traffic. Everyone's waiting to cross the street. No traffic. It says don't walk, and I walk, and everyone looks at me and gives me like the stink eye. I'm like, what's going on? It's like I was like, I've been in New York City. Like, if there's no cars, you walk. But the Germans were like, no, that's the rule. The rule is you wait till the light turns green and tells you can walk. Then you walk. It's just very different culturally. So it's a really great, interesting question to say. Well, what is it about classical Iraqi music? What's about that culture in terms of what they think is important that leads you to go to this Locrian mode and do that? And I think it's probably super interesting. I'd love to figure that out. But thank you for that question. Very interesting. All right, I'm going to be running out of battery soon, so I got so many great questions, and I really appreciate all this stuff. I might have to start moving a little faster, or maybe wrap things up in a little bit. So let me see where I'm at. Okay. Some good wishes. Thank you. A, B, C, D, E, E, no F, J, K, L, M, N. That's kind of funny. No F. That's good if you're taking that entry test. No Fs. Don't worry, Caleb. It'll be up on the archive. Danny, thanks for mentioning the Facebook group. We have a Facebook group. You can ask questions there, and people are really awesome about trying to help you out and answer questions. So Dr. B Music Theory Facebook group, Danny's mentioning that. Here's another question. Formal structure when we're talking about solo. Let's say one wants to compose a solo. How can he structure the solo so it makes sense, so it feels like a solo? Caleb, that's a great question, and it's a big one. So we don't have form like we do in classical music, where we talk like minuet and trio, sonata, rondo. We don't have those types of forms when we talk about improvised solos. So it's not like, say, a formal structure, other than what we use for improvised music is usually a sequence of chords. So let's say 12-bar blues, where it's 12 bars with a certain harmonic sequence, and you repeat it over and over and over and over. So it's like theme and variations. So improvisation, and for solos, is usually a set of harmonic sequence with a set number of chords, like the 12-bar blues, and it's like theme and variations, and you're just making new melodies and rhythms on top of that harmonic progression. So that's very, very strict formally, like 12-bar blues. Within that 12-bar blues, you want to structure your solo. So the structure usually comes in terms of energy. And you basically use the graph that is the case for almost all of kind of like a Western approach, where you start slow, you build it up, and then you wrap it up. And usually the build-up is about 2/3 of the way through, right? And there might be some peaks and valleys on the way up. You have a climax, a high point, and then you wrap it up. Sometimes in literature, denouement, I'm going to spell that wrong. It's like wrapping it up, the denouement. So whether it's literature or a movie, you know, and sometimes they might start high and then come down, but then you get to the higher point, you know, like that. But it's really the energy. And how do you develop energy? You're doing it by rhythm and the density of note, like the faster note values will give you more energy. So start off playing quarter notes and end up playing sixteenths. That'll do it. So 1 is that, and then 2 is the register. So start playing low on your instrument and end up playing high. So those are the basic things that are going to go into kind of developing a structure to your solo. Because the pitfall is you just improvise and it just sounds like, sometimes it seems random. So when people make fun of jazz, that's kind of what they're talking about, where the not best jazz, right? Let's say like jazz slightly substandard, they don't have this building of a solo. They don't have that, so it just sounds like endless variations without any ebb and flow of energy. It's just all at one level. So good question. Let me keep moving forward. If you only play 5/4, it's a Mixolydian feeling. Is that true? It all Oh, right. But then I see what you're saying. So but you wouldn't call it 5/4 if that were the case for what you're saying, Caleb. But I get it. So you're in the key of C major. If you go 5, 4, let me write 4 correctly. 5, 4, 5, 4, back and forth, right? It's going to sound like Mixolydian. And that's true. And the reason it sounds like Mixolydian is because this is no longer going to sound like 5. It's going to sound like, this is going to sound like 1, and this is going to sound like a subtonic flat 7 chord. So it's going to sound like you're going a G major triad, F major triad. You add G, B, D with F, A, C. You can see we're just missing the E, and you got yourself your Mixolydian scale, right? So if you just keep going back between 5/4, 5/4, it stops sounding like 5. It starts sounding like you're 1. And as soon as it starts sounding like you're 1, it ends up sounding like Mixolydian. So that's a good way to keep it in mind. But just remember, it's no longer 5/4. 5 and 4 is an analysis of how it relates to a tonal center. And if you keep emphasizing 5/4, 5/4, all of a sudden that becomes your new tonal center, your modal center. Augmented seconds sound like the scale ends at 6 and leaps to the octave, the 7th melding with the 8th. It's like there's a hole in the scale. Yeah, I can see what you're saying there, Alexander. Yeah, it feels like there's like a hiccup or a little hole in the scale. And I'm not saying that that's good or bad. I'm just saying that's how it feels. And those feelings, it's like that's what makes music so interesting. So many different variations and feelings. So Ron is asking I'm assuming with the frequencies, 440 or 445, does that screw up people with perfect pitch? For some people it does. It all depends. Like there's more than one kind of perfect pitch. There's people where they learn it and anything different like just totally screws them up. And there's other people where they can be a little bit more flexible with it. But I remember hearing about from a friend, like a friend of a friend who got perfect pitch while playing on a B-flat trumpet. So they basically, when they said C, they were hearing concert B-flat. And so that, like, when someone started to say, oh, what's that note on the piano, like, he'd get all confused because he learned it on a transposing instrument and made the association with the sound and what the letter is on a transposing instrument, and it really screwed with him. But there's other people who are like, okay, yeah, switch, got it. And they can just pivot between those two different things. So I don't think perfect pitch is a modern invention. I mean, I think people talked about Mozart having perfect pitch. I haven't done enough study into it to say that I know for certain you're wrong, but we certainly have heard lots of stories about Mozart hearing the music, being able to identify what the notes are, and then also have like a eidetic photographic memory and be able to remember it. And so I don't think something like perfect pitch could be a modern invention. And I've had a number of students with perfect pitch. I don't think that there's like some new mutation in human beings that happened that recently that allows for that to happen. And perfect pitch, like for most of us, if someone holds us up different colors, we no longer need to we don't really think about it. Like I hold it, I'd be like green, red, like it's automatic. My understanding is that perfect pitch is like that with the letters. Like you don't think about it anymore. It's just automatic. It's like, well, that's what we call red. A, B. It's like someone like myself, or most of us, looking at colors. But for most human beings, our visual acuity is better than our auditory acuity. So people who are able to have that or a comparable high level of auditory acuity in the sense of like just remembering what that frequency is, that it's called perfect pitch now. I don't know if they called it perfect pitch back in the day. So you might be right that they didn't call it that back then. But I think biologically, similar function probably happened. But that would be interesting to look into. If you want to have relative, this is Caleb, if you want to have relative pitch, you just need to find out what the lowest note that you can sing, and from that note you can go to any other note you want. Yeah, people often will use like how things feel in their own voice and be like, oh, I can sing down to let's say a low G or whatever. Good, so I sing that and I can then do relative pitches about comparing pitches to each other and being able to distinguish what that interval is. So yeah, that's part of it. Bad news, Caleb, is as you get older, usually your range changes. So you have to keep updating, not every day, but every year, like kind of like a physical, like a general physical. You'll be like, okay, where's my voice at this year? Because as you age, it does change. Next question, are there any downsides to a traditionalist approach to music composition, or should I try to learn modern composition techniques such as polytonality and atonality? That's a great question. There's certainly no downsides to traditional approach to music composition, none. And I would point out to you that the 99.9% of the human beings, I don't know, maybe that's too much. There's a large, let me put it this way, there's a large percentage of human beings in the world that listen to or watch Hollywood movies. Okay? For better or worse, Hollywood movies have culturally gone many, many places. Those movies are leaning on predominantly more traditional techniques. They are not normally polytonal, and very few of them use atonality. And when they do use atonality, it's as an effect in a limited spot and in a limited section. So if we look at what people actually listen to, polytonality, atonality, those are techniques that were developed in the early 1900s, so 1911, 1913, 1914, 1915. They're over 100 years old. So we're talking, when you say modern techniques of composition, we're talking about 100 years old modern, right? So we got to be clear about how we're saying. Now, certainly, that's more modern than the bulk of what I'm talking about in music theory. But interestingly, those techniques, that type of composition, is what's far, far more commonly consumed and listened to today. So I'd say start with that. Start with the tradition and start with your foundation. Then, as you add other things to it, you're able to kind of have more flexibility. Go with what the majority of people are listening to, and then see how you can add to it. And I think that's the right approach for a composer. All right, folks. We are coming up on the end of our thing. So I just want to read a little bit at the ending because I would want to learn for myself here. So Ascohatat was saying Iraq has maqam and every other neighboring country. Most of them close to Western mode, especially minor harmonic and Phrygian. Oh, interesting. This is where I don't know stuff. We have another person saying famous singer here in Iraq, Sa'adun Jaber, has a theory that in Iraq the mind state is very unsettled and unstable due to the wars through history, and they always have to look over their shoulders. And the stereotype in the Arab world that Iraqi music is the saddest music of them all, and Sa'adun says it's because of the same reason that people losing loved ones all the time. Wow, that's heavy and intense. Yeah, I can absolutely see that. Wow, I'm kind of getting chills just thinking about that. So, thank you for sharing that. That's intense stuff, right? The history of a people, of a culture, affects your outlook on life. Man, I feel super inspired to go look up this person and listen to their music now. It feels I got to end this thing, but it's like what a sobering note. It's like here in the United States, we're getting ready for Christmas and the holiday season and cheer and jingle bells, and now it's like, woo, yeah. But this is what it is to be human. Is the learning the spectrum of the emotions that are possible, and then learning how to make the most out of your life, to make it meaningful, to make it important. And so I think if I can turn it back to draw back a little bit, I think I'm really glad you are all here joining me this afternoon or evening, wherever it is you are. And I really appreciate all the questions, great questions, and I appreciate you all teaching me a little something about things that I'm now curious about looking into. I want to hear the saddest music in the world. I want to hear what that sounds like, and I want to hear the happiest music in the world too. I want to hear it all, and so I hope you all will embrace all those spectrums of what music is possible of communicating, and kind of take the best out of all of that to live a very full and hopefully happy life is what I wish for you all. So with that, thanks again for joining me here with Dr. B Music Theory, and I hope to see you all in 2 weeks. Take care, everybody.